Okay, thank you all for the opportunity and thanks for the organization and the excellent talks. I'm sorry I could not attend all the talks, but I found every talk I could attend absolutely fantastic. English is not my mother tongue, but I will present my talk in English today, so please do not hesitate to tell me if anything sounds unclear or a little funny. So today I'd like to talk about nature and teleology in Schelling's system of transcendental idealism of 1800. So Schelling's Naturphilosophie is often acknowledged as the emphasizing of teleological patterns in the study of nature. With Schelling, nature is not only an object of empirical physics, which gives us a theory of the exterior being, but becomes also an object of speculative physics, which makes us understand nature as a process through which matter gives birth to self-consciousness to reflect on itself. This general understanding of Schelling's Naturphilosophie characterizes teleology as the dynamical development of a process towards a certain purpose, through a series of stages that the mind must recollect, being its final state. The main problem of this common outline of the Naturphilosophie is that it misses both its transcendental and speculative originality. Actually, Schelling is rather critical of what he calls theological acknowledgements of Naturphilosophie, and this criticism of teleology is a central motive of the 1800 system des Transcendental and Idealismus. In the 1800 system, I defend the thesis that teleology designates two types of understanding of the Naturphilosophie that Schelling both distances himself from. One is the transcendental philosophy's take on the teleological judgment. After Kant's definition, Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zwecke, namely purposiveness without purpose, teleology presents a type of purposiveness present in living organisms in a specialized part of nature, and a type of judgment, that is to say, a subjective condition on propositions concerning natural products, and not an essential quality objectively possessed by natural products. This characterization of teleology as a type of judgment is central to the criticism of the Fichtean deduction of the objective determinations of nature. According to Schelling, Fichte has merely delivered a series of transcendental conditions that can hold no necessity on the determination of nature, and one must go beyond his transcendental outline to better understand the purposiveness present in nature. Secondly, the other criticism of teleology is aimed at Heilsauism, the idea that every matter is characterized as living being, as if designs were purposively followed, sought after by inorganic matter. This rejection of Heilsauism comes from its deleting the transcendental idealism framework. And Schelling goes as far as saying that this understanding of teleology is anti-philosophical in the erster Entwurf. Nobody would fail here to recognize a theoretical pattern close to what Kant called the antinomy of teleology in the critique of the power of judgment. In paragraph 72, Kant presents two understandings of nature, the idealism of final causes and the realism of natural ends. Both these positions are in a dialectical relationship, which means they equally presuppose the other. The idealist of final causes does not characterize natural causes as intentional, but as mere effect of dynamical laws. Kant puts Spinozism as a variety of idealism of natural causes, inasmuch as natural being, characterized as accidents of substance, must be, according to Kant, represented as effects of essential causes. On the other side, the realist of natural ends considers purposiveness as intentional design present in natural beings, a dogmatical position that is expressed in Hylozoism, matter as purposes life, and theism, God as intentional cause to natural processes. As we know, Kant rejects both positions. We can never rationally acknowledge for an intentional design in natural purposiveness, but the presupposition of such intentionality is heuristically necessary to theological judgments. The key one here is necessary. The assumption of an intentional design is a transcendental condition of our understanding of natural products, because we cannot grasp the causality at work in natural products without making a comparison, drawing a comparison with the causality of our own understanding, which is intentional. Otherwise, we can never fully decide between the mere mechanism of laws of nature and the intentional design of an intelligent cause outside of said laws, be it that of a supreme being. Because both these explanations come down to a suprasensible condition of objectivity that cannot be presented in any possible experience. I quote, this is paragraph 75, by the peculiar constitution of my cognitive faculties, the only way I can judge of the possibility of those things and of their production is by conceiving for that purpose a cause working designedly, and consequently a being whose productivity is analogous to the causality of an understanding. Unquote. How can Schelling assimilate the transcendental philosophy of nature to the idealism of final causes, even though this position was explicitly criticized by Kant as insufficient? How can the rejection of Hylozoism and the criticism of Kantian and Fichtean versions of the transcendental philosophy be brought together under the title of a criticism of teleology? The outtake of both these insufficient positions, according to Schelling, lies in the first word of the title of Schelling's book, the systematic nature of his outline of the philosophy of nature. In the Allgemeine Übersicht, Schelling compares his own philosophical method to Kant's through the image of the difference between an edifice, and a system. A system must investigate even beneath its foundations the ground on which it has been built. According to Schelling, what Hylozoism lacks is a transcendental framework that can give its assumptions a rational ground, and what transcendental philosophy lacks is an acknowledgement of nature that goes beyond a mere reflective judgment, that is to say, a judgment heuristically required to understand natural products. To clarify Schelling's argument on teleology, we should first consider the unique position of the 800 system in the works of Schelling. In the Münchner Vorlesungen of 1835, Schelling describes his own system of transcendental idealism as a clarification of the Fichtean Wissenschaftslehre that would answer a common criticism against it. The idea that Fichtean subjective idealism was so far from exteriority that it could no longer deduce objective reality. This type of criticism echoes the objections of Jacobi to the first edition of the Critique of Purism, summed up in the famous text on transcendental idealism, an appendix to the second edition to David Hume über den Glauben oder Idealismus und Realismus. The thing in itself was posited as absolutely unknowable by the transcendental subject, but it holds so much relevance to the rest of transcendental idealism that one could not enter the system without assuming its existence, hence shattering the entire system. So I quote, without the presupposition of the thing in itself, I was unable to enter into Kant's system, but with it I was unable to say within it, unquote. Schelling's system of transcendental idealism would be able to answer Jacobi's famous quip by emphasizing on the systematicity of transcendental idealism outlined by Fichte in the Wissenschaftslehre. However, I must say that in a sense, Schelling is not really worried by Jacobi's quip in the system of 1800. He states in a very Fichtean way that from a transcendental perspective, there is no problem in saying that the world is a series of representations insofar as exteriority is one of them. Of course, this characterization of the system of transcendental idealism is retrospective, but like Maxime Chédin, in his article Poser le moi comme inconscient, published in the Archives de Philosophie in 2010, I think that even though they underline the limits of such retrospective accounts of Schelling's own philosophy, we can still see in this account the centrality of the system of transcendental idealism in the works of Schelling. As a result, the system can be read as a mere transitory work between the first attempts at Naturphilosophie and the philosophy of identity. Or rather, we must understand how this stage of the development of Schelling's thought, where teleology is the penultimate stage of a system achieved in the philosophy of art, is a stepping stone. In the 1835 outline of the history of philosophy, it is not the Naturphilosophie nor the philosophy of identity that is quoted as the most important work of Schelling's youth, but the system of transcendental idealism. In 1800, the system was published after a series of works dedicated to Naturphilosophie. I already quoted parts of the Allgemeine Übersicht der neuesten philosophischen Literatur, published in 1797. We can add the Ideen zu einer Philosophie der Natur, published the same year, the erste Entwurf eines Systems des Naturphilosophie, published in 1798, and of course Die Weltseele, published in 1799 but written in 1797. How does the sketchy outline of teleology in the system of transcendental idealism complete this text? The Allgemeine Übersicht and the Ideen develop a Naturphilosophie within a transcendental framework, while the erste Entwurf and the Weltseele holds Naturphilosophie as the necessary foundation of transcendental idealism, inspired by the Spinoza's distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata. The system of transcendental idealism holds the view of a parallelism between Naturphilosophie and transcendental idealism. It is through the same movement that consciousness reproduces itself and that nature perpetuates its structures. And one could characterize the transcendental as analogous to the dynamic. The real and the ideal are characterized by a common effort towards the absolute, and the transcendental subject must posit nature as its own unconscious past, as its own odyssey. Many commentators have emphasized the parallelism of Naturphilosophie and transcendental idealism in the system of transcendental idealism. For example, Beiser in German Idealism, the struggle against subjectivism, with whom I fully agree when he says that Schelling had still not conceived of the single absolute standpoint that would unite both transcendental philosophy and philosophy of nature. In the preface of the 1800 System des Transcendentales in Idealismus, he asserted the equality of transcendental philosophy and the philosophy of nature, But he insisted that just because of their complementarity, they would never be able to form a unity, unquote. The system is definitely not Schelling's last word on teleology, and Naturphilosophie will have a growing importance in the further developments of his thoughts. However, this parallelism puts teleology in a very interesting position between philosophy of nature and transcendental idealism. The fact that teleology appears at the end of the system of 1800 shows its future crucial role in the unification of the two. Where does lie teleology in this account? Teleology, like the philosophy of art that closes the system, is actually extra systematic. According to a Fichtean model, the eye cannot reflect on itself in a transparent manner, and teleology and philosophy of art are the conclusive extra systematic manners of doing so. In the preface of the system, teleology is sketchily outlined as a solution, as a possible solution to the conflict between a mechanistic and a purposive explanation of the force of in nature. Quote, so far as concerns the basic principles of teleology, the reader will doubtless recognize for himself that they point to the only way of explaining the coexistence of mechanism with purposiveness in nature in an intelligent manner, unquote, and quote, nature as a whole and in its individual products will have to appear as a work both consciously engendered and yet simultaneously a product of the blindest mechanism. Nature is purposive without being purposively explicable. The philosophy of natural purposes, or teleology, is thus our point of union between theoretical and practical philosophy, unquote. Teleology answers the need for a predetermined harmony of the ideal and the real, of the conscious and the unconscious, of the transcendental affinity between the presentations of objects and the objects fulfilling these presentations, what Schelling calls, quote, highest task of transcendental philosophy, unquote. In that respect, the structure of the teleological contradiction is transferred to the unique position of teleology in respect to transcendental idealism and philosophy of nature. What I want to underline is that unlike Kant, who saw the teleological antinomy as a dialectic that shows how the division can't be resolved, but that the two positions at stake always presuppose the other, Schelling is convinced of the apparent unity for common sense, hence his emphasis on the anti-philosophical nature of the discourses that merge the two. As a result, transcendental idealism in his systematic outline has the transcendental task not to exactly show the unity, but actually to justify the divide and explain then how unity can be saved. In die Ideen zu einer Philosophie der Natur, he stated that the philosophers who have Universalantwort, to the universal answer to the unity of mechanistic and teleological forces, are actually merely repeating themselves without never actually making a point. So this is what Schelling would consider to be bad teleology, a theory that fails to justify the divide between mechanistic and theological force at work with nature, while also assessing the unity. There is something deeply Fichtean in this understanding of the systematic nature of the overcoming of the theological antinomy that Schelling pursues. Just as in Fichte, the self-consciousness of the transcendental ego must ground its own existence, the philosophy of identity that follows the system of 1800 will identify nature with the unconditional that must be seen as the a priori condition of self-consciousness, the Naturphilosophie becoming then the philosophical ground for transcendental idealism, redefined as the philosophy of philosophy. This helps to clarify the parallelism interpretative hypothesis I was presenting just beforehand, the system of transcendental idealism can also be read as a transcendental necessary addition to the Naturphilosophie of the Ideen and the Erste Entwurf. The foreword of this system of transcendental idealism shows that the system is integrative rather than exclusive of the previous attempts at Naturphilosophie. It is then transitory only in the sense that it helps unify a corpus that is now to be understood as twofold. As a result, I show that Schelling rethinks the Kantian distinction between reason and understanding, going beyond the use of teleology as a mere regulative concept, and that this rethinking of the distinction between reason and understanding entails a new Mariology. In order to understand the teleology of nature at stake in the system, it's important to compare it with what immediately precedes it, a practical philosophy, which gives a growing influence to history in the fourth part of the system. There is a clear analogy between history and nature in the system of transcendental idealism. I quote here Schelling: after this derivation now completed of the main characteristics of history, we must now inquire more closely into the transcendental possibility thereof, and this will lead us to a philosophy of history which later is for the practical part precisely what nature is for the theoretical part, unquote. Of course, nature is not history inasmuch as, like Kant stated in the Transcendental Dialectic of the First Critique, there is a dichotomy between the kingdom of ends, this suppressed sensible world, and the lawfulness of nature. What makes history different from nature is the possibility of freedom, and Schelling clearly underlines that actions in history can be autonomous and that the possibility of freedom divides the practical and the theoretical philosophy. Keeping this divide in mind, the analogy is still precious because Schelling does use a teleological model to conceptualize a transcendental concept of history. The practical philosophy problem is to conceive a pre-established harmony between the lawfulness of history, the objective, and freedom. To overcome the alternative between lawlessness and lawfulness, the determining and the determinant, we have to postulate an absolute that is the common ground between intelligence and freedom, that Schelling calls providence and equates to true religion. The famous metaphor of the Welttheater helps to picture this idea. History compared to a play with no playwright, the performance of every actor revealing his intention only progressively. This metaphor helps to understand how a final cause can be not exterior to its production, but historically revealed in a teleological process that progresses asymptotically. I don't wish to further discuss this metaphor. It was discussed actually by Manfred Frank and Hermann Sellner, who pointed out the limits of this metaphor in the context of the philosophy of history. But what I want to comment on is the way a theological model derives from history in the context of the antinomy of practical reason between freedom and lawfulness is expanded on the theoretical philosophy as regards nature. I quote here Schelling: if we wanted to speak of a history of nature in the true sense of the word, we should have to picture nature as though apparently free in its productions, it had gradually brought forth the whole multiplicity thereof through constant departures from a primordial original, which would then be a history not of natural objects, which is properly the description of nature, but of generative nature itself, unquote. The idea here is that we can view nature as history as regards the difference between individuals and species, every individual being an attempt at realizing an ideal that transcends every of them. We can see here that the main point of comparison between history and nature is the new Mariology, that the discussion of that the discussion of the theological antinomy entails. Schelling departs from the conscious distinction between reason as the faculty of internal finality and understanding as the faculty of external finality, and the organic-inorganic division replaces this difference between organisms. Finality is completely internal and designates only a movement from one part to the whole. This model of organism rather than finality has been brilliantly studied by Gilbert Kircher in an article from 1977 published in Studi Urbinati, Kant et Schelling, Finalité et Organisme. In the context of the interpretation of the quote of generative nature, I think that what Schelling calls generative is a translation of this model, where individuals are now thought as part of larger organisms that are still intermediate species. This is an interesting lesson that Feuerbach will remember, and in the context of Naturphilosophie, it shows how much Schelling's hypotheses are detailed. They are intermediary stages of organicity between concrete individuals and the idea of nature as a universal organism that is developed in the Weltseele. While agreeing on the, with Kircher on the general shift from Kantian finality to organism, I think we can underline the originality of the argument of the system of transcendental idealism in its consequences to the way the study of speciation, that is to say, the productivity of intermediate level organisms, would be part of a history of generative nature. The second consequence, we can grow from the application of the historical model of teleology of nature, is the parallelism between organisms and freedom, inasmuch they synthesize the practical and the theoretical philosophy. It's the same concept, monogram, that Schelling uses for both. In the system of transcendental idealism, I quote, every organism is a monogram of that original identity, unquote, between the objective and the subjective, a statement which echoes the idea that, quote, autonomous spirit is a monogram of freedom, unquote, in the allgemeine Übersicht der neuesten philosophischen Literatur. The concept of monogram is notoriously of Kantian origin. It enigmatically designates the way pure a priori imagination produces schemata. A monogram is a sketch, an outline, or a silhouette that can figuratively manifest a concept in sensible terms. It is still an ongoing debate to determine whether monograms are of preconceptual nature, or whether the distinction between schemata or concepts only work on this transcendental level. But I do not think that for Schelling, that's the main point. I think for Schelling, it's more interesting to interpret the concept of monogram in the idea of the tracing of a sketch. Like the painter who first sketches an outline of the picture, organisms and autonomous spirit are presenting a unity of the objective and the subjective that still can't be properly reflected on by the self. For Schelling, the monogram speaks figuratively or figurates a unity of the finite and the finite in the case of freedom. This emphasis on the figurative nature of the monogram must be distinguished from indirect presentations in symbols developed in the first critique, and excessive presentation in the sublime and in art that will be central to the intuition akin to the philosophy of art that closes the system. In the beginning of the principle of teleology, Schelling states that nature in its purposive form speaks figuratively. The concept of monogram can be interpreted as a shift toward a hermeneutical interpretation of nature and history. In this reading of Schelling, we can see how teleology shifts from an economical model of harmony between laws producing the best possible order of nature to a hermeneutical model of teleology where its traces have to be interpreted. This shift can be further justified through a remark of Schelling about Fichte in the 1806 Darlegung des Wahrheitsverhältnisse der Naturphilosophie zur verbesserten Fichtes der Lehre. While posterior to the system of transcendental idealism, I think it expands views already expressed in it, because Schelling accuses Fichte of holding what he calls an economic theological principles of nature, insofar as nature would be for Fichte something to be used. And Ian Hamilton Grant famously underlines this difference in Fichte and Schelling. Of course, this account of teleology remains incomplete and only sketched in the system of transcendental idealism, in which it is the philosophy of art that actually closes the system. To conclude this talk, I'd like to just give a few words about the use of this teleology in the context of French phenomenology, and especially of Michael Dufresne. Michael Dufresne was a French phenomenologist who famously wrote the Phenomenology of Aesthetic Experience, and he was often read as a continuator of Merleau-Ponty. Michael Dufresne spoke of, in the context of phenomenology, of aesthetic experience as producing a reduction. That is to say that in aesthetic experience, we can feel the affinity, the intricate relationship between the eye and the world. And all his work try to preserve this relationship. Michael Dufresne tried to think this relationship and to ground it, and to ground this relationship, intimate relationship between man and the world that is discovered through aesthetic experience. He talks of an a priori of the phenomenological correlation, and he calls it nature. He uses here the Schellingian concept of Naturphilosophie, while stressing the non-theological nature of his use of the concept, especially in the context of his atheism, and because he wants to combine his metaphysics with a phenomenological framework. And I think this attempt, especially in his book of 1961, The Poetic, is a quite interesting reuse of the Schelling's Naturphilosophie, because in the context of the 60s, it was more the last philosophy of Schelling that was read by French phenomenologists, especially through the lens of Vladimir Jankélevich's thesis on the Odyssey of the consciousness inside the last philosophy of Schelling. And I think that Michael Dufresne found in this account of the first Naturphilosophie of the system of transcendental idealism a way to combine his phenomenological atheism with a metaphysic of the poetic. Okay, so I thank you for your attention.